Hello friends, and welcome to this third video looking for an answer to the question, if God is in control, why is there so much evil in the world? As I shared with you already, there are really three rebellions that need to be looked at to discover what happened. So far, we discussed rebellion number 1. That involved a serpent, Nakash, who was really one of God's spiritual children, Satan, who rebelled against him in leading Adam and Eve into sin. And the result was the closing off of the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life to God's human family. Mankind would from that point on experience death. We then looked at rebellion number 2, and that involved a number of God's spiritual children, referred to as the sons of God, who in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, left the spiritual realm and united themselves with women here on earth, which would ultimately lead to God bringing a flood upon the earth. Before we move ahead to rebellion number 3 that transpired at the Tower of Babel, I'd like to share some important information relating to just how much damage these rebellion number 2 rebels created for mankind, how much evil they brought into our world. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, we see one of the Bible's most vivid descriptions of total depravity. It says, "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time." And 5 verses later, in verse 11, that description was expanded upon. It says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways." Now that seems pretty clear, doesn't it? The second rebellion was devastating. Although these statements in the Bible are essentially a summary of the effect of the transgression, if we look into the later Second Temple Jewish literature, we find much more detail. First Enoch chapter 8 goes on to elaborate how certain watchers, which is another term for sons of God, corrupted humankind by means of the sharing of forbidden divine knowledge. In other words, teaching humanity to destroy themselves by leading them into idolatry, by teaching them skills and techniques of warfare, also all about growing herbs to intoxicate themselves, lessons on astrology, and arts of seduction to proliferate immorality. In essence, these rebels kickstart human destruction. I would say that provides a pretty good overview of evil that is ultimately with us even today, as is the influence of false gods. So now, what appears to be approximately 400 years forward, we come to rebellion number 3, the Tower of Babel. Like the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah's flood, you may have heard of the Tower of Babel. If not, that's okay, because even most churchgoers don't realize what really happened there. The story of the Tower of Babel is found in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, that I'd like to share with you. And it begins in verse 1. "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.' But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, 'If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, Let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So now after the flood, God wanted Noah's descendants to multiply and spread out over the earth, and he gave them this instruction: be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Well, they were certainly not filling the earth. They were congregating in one place with a totally different agenda. Like Adam and Eve, they were supposed to be God's co-workers, imagers, to maintain creation. Instead of doing that, they gathered at a place called Babel, and they built a tower, and as it says, to their own glory. In actuality, the tower they built is referred to as a ziggurat, and their goal was to bring God down to them. And this certainly didn't fit into God's plan. Now that's the familiar version of the story, but further significance is found in two unfamiliar verses in another biblical book. And here they are: Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. And by the way, this is referred to as the Deuteronomy worldview. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance. So you can see how these verses do relate to what I read earlier. Now these two verses tell us that one of the judgments at the Tower of Babel was the division of mankind. Up until this point in the story, God was dealing with humanity as a collective whole. That changed at Babel. Human beings would be segregated by language and geography. Even worse, God divorced himself from humanity. Fed up with human defiance of his will, another way of saying rebellion, God assigned the nations of the earth to other members of his supernatural family, the sons of God. Now this was a different group than those who transgressed before the flood. You see, God couldn't kick humanity out of his house. I mean, he already did that back in Eden. He had promised not to destroy humanity after the flood, so there would be no repeat of that disaster. So what else could he do? He eventually said, enough. If you don't want me to be your God, I'll assign you to some of my heavenly assistants. The fallout of this judgment took many forms. We aren't told how long it took, but the Bible tells us that the supernatural sons of God assigned over the nations did a lousy job. They became so corrupt, as we see in Psalm chapter 82. It says in there that God had to judge them as well, and that one day he would take away their immortality and take back the nations. For our purposes here, God's frustration left him childless, in a sense, in terms of having a human family. He'd had it. He'd given up. Well, not quite. You see, there was no plan B. God was going to have a human family. So guess what happened right after the Tower of Babel catastrophe? God appeared to Abraham, an old man married to an old woman, Sarah, who both were beyond the age where they could have children. God made a covenant with Abraham. He promised the old man and his wife that they would have a son. God would do a miracle. Their son would be the beginning of a new family for God on earth. Having allotted humanity to the oversight of members of his heavenly host, God wanted to begin anew with a family of his own with Abraham. Abraham believed God's promises, and I want you to know that this relationship between God and Abraham started with God. All Abraham had to do was believe and have faith. Promising Abraham a son, and through him the start of a new family that would grow into a great nation, was God's second covenant after the disaster of Eden. The first had been with Noah. Both were designed to preserve his dream of having a human family. You see, God had not given up on humanity. He couldn't stop loving people. He still wanted a human family, and Abraham's family would become known as Israel, the name most frequently used in the Old Testament for God's human family. But what about the people from the other nations, the ones that God had assigned to the sons after the Tower of Babel rebellion? They are called Gentiles in the Bible, a short term that means not from Israel. And despite what happened at Babel, God did not forget about these people. Actually, he told Abraham that his descendants would someday be a blessing to the other nations God had forsaken. And you can find that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we see that Gentiles could join God's family by choosing to reject all the other gods, believing in him, and taking the sign of God's covenant. It would be great to say that all went well from then on for Israel, but that would not be true. The Lord's portion, as it's called in Deuteronomy 32:9, wasn't a pretty one. They were God's people, but sadly, perhaps predictably, their loyalty failed. The darkest hour was yet to come. So far, we've been focusing on the answer to the question, if God is in control, why is there so much evil in the world? Well, 3 rebellions. That's the answer. It's vital to remember that what has been transpiring up to this point, and even into our day, is spiritual warfare between Yahweh and his adversaries in the spiritual realm, and Yahweh and his adversaries here on earth. So here we are, approximately 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. The ultimate good news, an answer to how this momentous event led to a defeat of the results of these 3 rebellions. That is an exciting lesson, and I hope to see you again next week for what is called a truly good news message, and an introduction to the next question that we're going to look at, that I know I've heard asked time and again, with an answer that is really a part of the teaching today. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. And in case I forgot to mention, share it with other people you might know who have questions. The state of our world will bring many, many people to a place of wondering. Goodbye for now, and God bless.